Okay, as we continue our tour of structures of the brain, the next area or system of structures that we're going to look at is the limbic system. Now, you might notice that the limbic system structures are all located kind of near the center of the brain. And as the slide here indicates, this is a system that, although it has kind of diverse functions, like we're going to see, um, it typically is linked to emotional type of responses, some motivational issues, and of course we're actually already familiar with a structure that's involved in some memory functions. So as we fill in our diagrams here, one thing that we want to might include is perhaps you want to take out a marker or highlighter and kind of color in some of these things so you can see distinctively where they are. The hypothalamus is the name given to a structure that literally sits beneath the thalamus. That's what hypothalamus actually means. So we'll come to an explanation of what that does in a second. The pituitary gland is represented in this diagram by this little squiggly kind of structure. That, as you may remember from your reading in Module 10, is not only a part of the brain, but it also plays a key role in controlling functioning of the endocrine system. So nervous system structure and an endocrine system structure. This darker purple structure on this diagram is representing the amygdala, and the arm of the hippocampus we see here kind of wrapping around. Now, one thing that is a little confusing is you're seeing only like a 2D flat version of this. I'm also going to be including in this post some links to a 3D version of the brain that might be helpful as you create your models because it'll allow you to kind of manipulate the stuff in a more three-dimensional type of view. The flat view of these structures is not always super helpful, but also in this diagram we can kind of see the top of the thalamus and the brainstem structures kind of here in shadow. Here's our cerebellum, just so you're kind of oriented to where in the brain we're talking about. So we'll start with a structure that you're a little more familiar with. The hippocampus, again represented by the lighter purple structure here. It's kind of a weird funky shape thing. We learned last unit that this is really involved in the processing of explicit memories. So when people experience damage to this, like we saw in Clive Wearing, it would create problems encoding new conscious or declarative types of memories, a condition called anterograde amnesia. So we actually know that the hippocampus continues to develop even as we age, and it changes in response to experiences that we have had. So there's some really interesting research going on right now about the structures or the functions of the hippocampus and how it enables memory in adults. But the amygdala, which we see right here in this darker purple kind of structure indicated on your diagram, and which also I would add is kind of misleading because you actually have two of these things, one on each kind of arm or branch of the hippocampus, if you want to think about its location here. These are a couple of, they're usually described as almond-shaped neural clusters that are very much involved in aggression and fear responses. Your book gives a couple examples of this. If you sever the amygdala, so essentially destroying them or lesioning them, you might produce an animal that seems to not have or exhibit aggressive responses. So if you sever the amygdala of a cat, you get one chilled out, relaxed cat that doesn't seem to get upset, even when you introduce things that should otherwise be either anxiety provoking or stressful for the animal. If you stimulate the amygdala, so kind of artificially activate it by introducing some electrical activity, then depending on where the area is stimulated, you might get a very aggressive response, so a very mean kitty, if we're talking about in a cat, or the example we looked at earlier in some of your practice questions was, okay, maybe if you stimulate the amygdala of a cat in an area known and linked to fear responses, it might actually cower in fear in the presence of a mouse, which is a very exaggerated fear response for a cat. Now, we do have to be a little bit careful, especially as we move forward in understanding the brain. Usually these brain parts that we're talking about are not it might not be the only area involved in that response. So while it's tempting to talk about the amygdala as like the center for fear and aggression, certainly there are other brain areas that are involved in these things, especially in humans. For example, in humans, the amygdala actually does turn out to be important in aggressive and violent behavior, but so too are the frontal lobes, because one of the jobs of the frontal lobes up here in the cerebral cortex is to inhibit behaviors, as we think about like long-term planning, when we consider consequences of our actions, the frontal lobes actually help restrain sometimes the impulses that might be coming from the amygdala. So this is all a little bit more complicated than these oversimplified diagrams sometimes suggest. Now, a structure that we have not yet discussed in the limbic system is this hypothalamus. And again, as I mentioned, it's named for the fact that it sits beneath the thalamus, slightly in front of and below it, with the front, of course, of our face or head over here. The hypothalamus has many diverse jobs, so it's going to show up in several different areas as we move through the year in AP psychology. One way of characterizing its primary role is by saying, well, this directs a bunch of maintenance types of activities, things that your body needs to stay alive. So drive-related behaviors, so your drive to eat or to drink when you're thirsty. It also seems to play a role in regulating body temperature. So some folks who have tumors pressing up against the hypothalamus actually experience either like excessive sweatiness and perspiration because they're too hot, or feeling too cold. So there's perhaps some dysregulation of the hypothalamus that might be causing that. The hypothalamus also has a role in directing the activity of the pituitary gland. It's not by accident, perhaps, that these things are placed directly next to each other in the brain, because the hypothalamus seems to have a role in monitoring our blood chemistry, so knowing the levels of hormones and other substances in the blood, and it then directs the activities of the pituitary gland to call for the release of more hormones from the endocrine system if needed. So, for example, if okay, your testosterone levels are perhaps too low or dropping below a normal amount, the hypothalamus may, in some sense, become aware of that and trigger your pituitary gland to release more testosterone, trigger like the gonads to produce more testosterone if we're talking about males. The pituitary gland, you might remember from either like maybe your health class or other anatomy classes, is sometimes referred to as the master gland of the endocrine system, because it does direct all of the other endocrine system glands in the body. So it has an important role in like human growth and development during puberty, for example. We also sometimes talk about the hypothalamus's role in directing or monitoring pleasure centers that release the neurotransmitter dopamine. So in a sense, this area might become active when you do things that are life-sustaining or perhaps sustaining of the species. So eating, again, and drinking, those kinds of behaviors are pleasurable in part because they produce a dopamine release that makes you want to do them again. Sexual behavior, same deal, even though, of course, that doesn't contribute to your survival, but it does help maintain the survival of the species itself. For that reason, we sometimes talk about the role of the hypothalamus is being involved in the 4 F's, fight and flight responses. So, okay, this would be the structure that calls for the release of adrenaline, for example, during the fight or flight response. Feeding, in a reference to eating, because it triggers release of hormones that might make you hungry, and fornication, which is another way of talking about sexual behavior. So a whole host of human behaviors accounted for by some activity within the limbic system.